Nazywam się Jarosław Dumanowski, jestem historykiem i dzisiaj w ramach programu European Food Education Season, czyli w ramach sezonu na edukację gastronomiczną w całej Europie, chcielibyśmy Wam przedstawić kilka dań, kilka pomysłów z kuchni włoskiej, klasycznej kuchni włoskiej. Po pierwsze, gnocchi. Nie będzie to jednak tylko opowieść, jak się robi gnocchi, chociaż to jest bardzo ważne, bo nauczy nas tego profesor Fabio Parasecoli, specjalista w dziedzinie Food Studies w Nowym Jorku, oraz Jarek Walczyk, szef klubu szefów kuchni, ale jednocześnie dowiemy się prostej kombinacji ziemniaków i pomidorów. Jak to się stało, że tak egzotyczne rzeczy stały się symbolem kuchni włoskiej?
Ciao, my name is Fabio Parasecoli. I'm Italian from Rome, but I live and work in New York City, where I teach food studies. Today, I'm going to make a simple recipe that we very often make at home. Gnocchi with a tomato sauce. And I will make two different kinds of tomato sauce, and I'll explain why. Why did I choose this dish? Because gnocchi and tomato sauce is something very common and a dish that people think it's been in Italy for the longest time. As a matter of fact, as we'll explain while I prepare my recipe, potato are a relatively recent addition to Italian cuisine, and so are tomatoes. So this is just to show how a dish that looks like it's been there forever actually has a much shorter history than one could think. We've already boiled the potatoes with their peels on. One of the problems with gnocchi is that you don't want too much water in the potatoes. So you leave the peel on while you're boiling them, and you peel them after. We will use a ricer to rice them. And you can use a piece of wood like that, the same one that you would use maybe for pierogi. It's important to let the potato cool off and lose moisture, so that when you add the flour, they will keep better. So you just rice them in the middle of your wood plank, and you create sort of a little mound that will help the potato cool off. All right? You see how the potato is riced? It allows for air to circulate, which will make the more moisture leave the potato, and so the final result, the final gnocchi, will probably be better. So next thing, I will use some flour that I will just put on top like this. And at any rate, gnocchi is basically flour and potato, so you can use quite a bit. While this cool off, now I will start with the sauces. So I will be making two different tomato sauces. Why? Because not all the time you might find nice ripe tomatoes like this. So we start by cutting the tomatoes, of course. So tomatoes, as much as we think, they are quintessentially Italian, it's sort of a symbol of Italian cuisine. Of course, tomato, just like potatoes, were not present in Europe before the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas. So it's part of what historians call the Columbian exchange. So the exchange of crops, of animals, but also with microorganisms that happened when the Europeans started traveling to the Americas, bringing their food with them. And so, for instance, they introduced stuff like wheat, olives, onions, cabbage, many products in the Americas. On the other hand, they brought many products from the Americas into Europe. The most important are probably potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and peppers. But there are many more. For instance, many of the beans we eat today are actually of American origin. So as much as tomatoes are used in Italy now and are really symbolic of Italian cuisine, that was not the case for a long time. So at first, tomatoes were introduced just as decoration. People find them pretty. And so they were used as garden plants or to create decorations for the table. That's the reason why the yellow one were preferred. They were beautiful, they looked like gold, and in fact, the name in Italian for tomato is pomodoro, which means golden apple. So for a couple of centuries, I would say, tomatoes was not considered something that you would eat. So here I've cut enough tomatoes, and I'll start making one of the two sauces. So we get some extra virgin olive oil. In Italy, different regions traditionally use different cooking fats. So in other parts of Italy, the main cooking fat might be butter. And in many mountain regions also, they use pork fat. But for this recipe, we'll stick to olive oil, which I think gives the best flavor, the best result. So we use some garlic, maybe put 2, 3, 4 cloves. Garlic is very also typical, especially in southern Italy, to the point where I live now in the US. Traditional Italian-American cooking is really rich in garlic, to the point that for us, coming from Italy, it might be a little much. For this sauce, I'll make it a little spicy, and so I'll use some red chili peppers. As we said, also the chili peppers came to Europe with the Colombian exchange. So if you don't want too much heat, it's easier to just take out the seeds and the central veins of the chili pepper. I chopped it in sort of larger pieces, so if you don't like it, you can move it from your dish or from your fork. So once you've cut your chili peppers, you can add them to your oil. So again, the warm oil will take some flavor out of the peppers. Let it brown a little bit. Be careful it doesn't stick, of course, or it doesn't burn. There is nothing worse than burnt garlic. Okay, so we have enough tomatoes here, and we're gonna add them just like this to the pot. Actually, I can use my hands. Again, we're cooking at home. So now you let it cook a little bit. Of course, we need to add a little water because you can see here the heat is a little strong and you don't want your sauce to burn. Even better, a little stock. That's okay. So now the sauce will cook slowly. All we need to add a little salt and a little pepper. So in the meantime, while this simmers slowly, the tomatoes need their time to sort of cook down, but you can still see them. We will prepare the other one, which is sort of the quick version that you can make when you don't have fresh tomatoes. Again, we start with a little olive oil. And we can add a little garlic. It's easier to keep it whole so you can take it out. And you can also add a little piece of onion. Some people like to have it cut and cook it with the sauce, but if you don't like too much onion, you can just leave it whole. It's easier to take it out when it's ready. So let's go back to tomatoes while we prepare the other sauce. So we said that for a couple of centuries, people really didn't eat tomatoes. We start seeing recipes with tomatoes in the 17th century in the area of Naples, which was very much under the influence of Spain. The first recipe we see, it really looks like Mexican salsa. So the tomatoes were supposed to be roasted and peeled, broken in little pieces, and then seasoned with chilies, with onions. So our oil is warm enough. We take them out of the heat a little bit. And these are simple peeled canned tomatoes that are also very much part of Italian everyday cooking. So now we have two simple sauces cooking, but they go very, very well with the gnocchi. Of course, also here, we're gonna add some salt and a little bit of pepper. But let's go back to our history of tomatoes while we have our two sauces. So we said in the 17th century, we see tomatoes appear in cooking books in the South under the Spanish influence. Then the following century, in the 18th century, we start seeing something that is much more similar to what we considered as tomato sauce in contemporary Italy now. But still, you had the addition of meat stocks, other elements. Tomato sauce will become what we know now really in the 19th century. Also because at the time, Italy had become a unified country. But what happened is that Italy started having a better distribution system thanks to the train. So the railway started developing, which allowed to move products from one part of the country to another. At the same time, we have the development of appertization, which is the technology that allows you to make cans, to can food. So putting these two things together, you start having the development of a canned tomato industry. The tomato left the south and started also being grown in more northern parts. Now the area of Parma, a city that is very famous for prosciutto, for Parmigiano Reggiano, for balsamic vinegar. It's also an area where lots of tomatoes are grown to be canned. So in the 19th century, we start seeing the connection between pasta and tomato becomes a pretty simple sauce that can be added in many things. Already in the very important cookbooks from 1891 by Pellegrino Artusi called the Science in the Kitchen, we have different recipes for tomato sauce that are really much like what we do today. So just to sum up the story, a product that is now one of the symbols of Italian cuisine. Think how many recipes you've seen of tomato sauce on pasta or on pizza or in many other dishes. Well, it's a recent addition to the culinary history of Italy, but we love it very much. It's now very much part of who we are in terms of culinary culture. And we can continue letting these simmer a little bit. And we go back to our gnocchi. So our potatoes have cooled off now. You can see I can touch them. So what you do now is you add flour. There is no specific quantity that you might want to use because it really depends on the variety of the potato, how much water is in the potato, how much water the potatoes absorb during cooking. So you start adding flour, trying to get to a nice consistency. You might want to be a little delicate because you don't want your gnocchis to be too tight. But you want to make sure that the flour absorbs the moisture and makes it into a nice dough. See, with this kind of potatoes that we're using now, we already have a very doughy texture. So we can add a little more and always keep flour around so that it doesn't stick to your wooden board. Also potatoes, as we mentioned, arrived in Italy with the other products from the Americas. Now it took even longer for potatoes to be accepted in Italian cuisine. At the beginning, people thought they were actually dangerous and they could poison you. Maybe because at the beginning people didn't know what to do with it, so besides eating the potatoes itself, they would eat the plant and they would also eat the flowers. And of course, those are not very healthy. So potatoes became more popular in Europe starting in the 17th century because of many charistes that hit different parts of Europe. So you started seeing it in Ireland, then you start seeing them in Germany, and at that point, also the French discovered the potatoes. Mr. Parmentier is usually indicated as the person that helped introducing potatoes in France. And so also at that time, they arrive in Italy. And they start being used in different ways, often replacing ingredients that were already familiar to Italians. See, now you have sort of a nice dough, similar of when you make your dough maybe for pasta or in Poland for pierogi. And you keep on adding until you feel that the dough is tight enough. This is how my mom taught me how to make gnocchi. So you put your dough on one side of your board, and you make sure to cover everything well with flour so that the gnocchi don't stick. What you do, you cut a little piece and you start working it like this with your hands. This is the most rustic, but also the most traditional way to make your gnocchi. You try to make it so that they more or less have the same width, so they cook at the same time, and then you simply cut them in little pieces like this. And then you put them aside to dry a little bit. So once you've cut your little gnocchi, there are different ways to make it. Some people use a fork and just do this, right? Some people use their fingers and just do this. And this is, for instance, the way we do it at home. It just makes it easier for the sauce to get into the gnocchi. It's important that the gnocchi rest a little bit before you boil them, so that you make sure that they dry a little bit. Again, it's very important that the humidity leaves the potatoes. This is potato gnocchi, but in Italy we have several kinds. Actually, this sort of little dumpling has been around since the Middle Ages, for sure. It was not made with potatoes because we didn't have potatoes, but sometimes gnocchis can be made with ricotta cheese, and those are very good. You add some celery in them, they're actually delicious. In Rome, we have gnocchi that are made with semolino wheat. And so you prepare your gnocchi, you make them a little larger and flat, and you cover them with butter and cheese, and you grill them in the oven. When potatoes were introduced in Italy, people just replaced the main ingredient, the main staple, with potatoes. So you leave some space among the gnocchi. You make sure that they don't stick to each other. Now they're still a little humid, and so they could become very sticky, and they wouldn't cook well. Unlike potatoes, flour was present in Italy from antiquity. Probably was introduced from the Middle East, from the Fertile Crescent, hundreds of years, even before the Romans, even before the Greeks arrived in southern Italy. The Romans were great consumers of flour and above all bread, to the point that many of their conquerors developed precisely to find places where to grow enough wheat for the empire. So the Romans started expanding south. First, they conquered Sicily, which became their breadbasket. And then they started expanding along the Mediterranean to the point that Egypt, as you know, became part of the Roman Empire, precisely because it was strategic for the production of wheat. During the final years of the Roman Republic and during the empire, the poor people of Rome became used to get free distributions of wheat and bread. And if they didn't get them, they would riot. So making sure that people had enough bread was a crucial political issue. At the time, it was easier to bring your wheat into Rome by boats. Ground transportation was very, very bad, and so much of the wheat will be brought into the port of Ostia, which is just a few miles from Rome. And that became the center into which all the ships that brought wheat from around the Mediterranean arrived. Wheat remained a very popular crop in Italy, also after the end of the Roman Empire, when Germanic tribes started settling in Italy. Of course, they introduced other grains, but wheat remained quite popular through the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and to modern times. As you know, Italians love their pasta and their pizza that are based on wheat. So this is an interesting dish because it puts together very ancient crops and also new arrival in Italy to create something new that now has become as symbolic of Italian culinary culture as many other dishes. So now we have put some water on the stove. Now it's already boiling. It needs to be really boiling. You cannot cook gnocchi in sort of just simmering water. You add salt, quite a bit. You need salted water because the gnocchi sometimes tend to be a little bland. Even if you add salt to the gnocchi, it's always good to cook in abundant, salty water. You just take them and you pour them in the water. Use something to mix them. You make sure that they don't stick to each other. You see now that the gnocchi have brought the water temperature down, so it's not boiling as hard as before, but it will come back in a second. So when are gnocchi ready? Simply when they float. So now we're waiting for the gnocchi to come up. From time to time, it's always good to delicately move them. See, they're coming up already, and that's what tells you that they're ready. And you can scoop them out. So we can start scooping them out. We put them in our dish. Be careful to scoop only those that have floated. No, don't go too deep, otherwise you'll get the raw ones. So this is our first dish. Very simply, we take our sauce and we put it on our gnocchi. We make sure not to add the garlic, because that wouldn't taste too good. We mix it a little bit so that we make sure the sauce goes everywhere. And you make sure that, when you're ready to serve, you put whole tomatoes on top so it also looks better on the table. If you have guests, you might want to do something that also looks nice. And this is the final dish, the gnocchi with the fresh tomato sauce.
So, let's try. Really nice.
See, it's not too spicy, but just a little bit to give it.
But I prefer like this. Przyjemne, bardzo fajne. Taka wycieczka do Włoch właściwie.
But see, without the egg, they're really soft. If you add the egg, they're easy to cook because they don't break, but they become tighter. So this is our second batch. This, we're going to use it with the other sauce that we made with canned tomatoes. Again, we make sure not to get the garlic, not to get the onion. Those can stay in the pot. There we go. We mix it up a little bit, always delicately. These gnocchi were without egg, so you cannot be too rough. A good idea with this kind of sauce is to add a little bit of Parmesan cheese. We have some Parmesan cheese, a grater, and we can just grate some on top. It adds nice flavor, it adds a little saltiness, and then we can finish a little bit of parsley that you have chopped fresh. And by the way, you've got the colors of the Italian flag, red, white, and green. And here you have this other dish of gnocchi with tomato sauce, Parmigiano Reggiano, and parsley.